South African context, apartheid revisionism is a growing movement, largely within conservative Afrikaner circles, to reevaluate the history, motives, and outcomes of the apartheid era.
Which, by the way, if I say apartheid, it is actually just a word for segregation, an Afrikaans word for segregation.
It does range from more sensible attempts to contextualize the era to more lewd attempts to sanitize the past to protect current minority feelings and a sense of self.
It is necessary for us to discuss these topics today. And if you guys look at history, history is never objective. There's the saying that history is always written by the victor.
Recent revisionist narratives typically shift the focus away from racial supremacy and towards three main pillars. First, they start with the idea of grand apartheid. Revisionists in South Africa often frame separate development, the official name of apartheid, not as a system of oppression, but as a failed attempt at decolonization. They argued that the National Party intended to create independent nation states for different ethnic groups, the Bantustans, the homelands, similar to how Europe divided into different nations. This reframes the architects of apartheid as misguided idealists, rather than engineers of a crime against humanity driven by racial hatred. Second, the apartheid revisionists create a lesser of two evils narrative. A common theme in recent years in the comparison between the stability of the apartheid state and the failure of the post-1994 government, the ANC, is that the revisionist highlights the infrastructure, functional state-owned enterprises, and how low violent crime rates were in the 1960s and the 70s. This narrative omits a couple of things. It usually ignores the fact that the stability was built on the systematic exclusion and repression and state-sponsored violence against the majority of the population who had already had most of their rights removed, while areas populated by black people had far less infrastructure and development in the first place. Third, South African apartheid revisionist looks to share the guilt or build an argument around colonial origin. This branch of revisionism argues that the British, not the Afrikaners, invented the tools of segregation, such as the 1913 Land Act and the concentration camps during the Boer War. The logic here is that by placing the original sin on British imperialism, revisionists attempt to dilute the specific moral culpability of the Afrikaner National Party. If you dare, buy us a coffee. The link is in the description. So why does this even matter? This revisionism creates a significant memory gap in South African society. If one group believes the past was not that bad, it becomes nearly impossible to agree on the past, on history, on what reality is. And I suppose that's what the revisionist is aiming for in one sense. It fuels the Lager mentality, a feeling of being under siege, which leads to further social withdrawal into private enclaves. And if you give the benefit of the doubt, I think you would understand this to some degree, especially the way the country is being run. It is, of course, a dishonest method to use by lying about apartheid. You could just be honest about why you're doing it, because most people would understand. When you use revisionism to build this Lager mentality, you're creating a false narrative that is going to yield very negative results in the long term for everybody in this country. In 2019, the South African Equality Court ruled that the gratuitous display of an old 1928 flag constitutes hate speech. Revisionists often fight these rulings as attacks on history and heritage, yet they want Malema to stop singing Kill the Boer. Let's look at it side by side. The more factually based view of apartheid and the revisionist view. The Orthodox view would say the nature of apartheid is that it was a crime against humanity. The revisionist view would say it was a failed socio-political experiment. The Orthodox view would say that the Bantustans were puppets used for dispossession of land and rights. The revisionist view would say it was an attempt at ethnic self-determination. The Orthodox view would say that apartheid pre-1994 economy was built on cheap, exploited labor. The revisionist view would say that it was a period of peak South African excellence.
Okay.
Most common sense people can get their mind around the simple idea that systematic deprivation of rights based on race is inherently a crime, regardless of the order or infrastructure it might produce. It's still repression. Handcuffs are still handcuffs, even though they're made of gold. A fat chained dog is still chained, even though the unchained dog is thin and skinny. If you dare, buy us a coffee. The link is in the description.
So, if you look at the areas of land that was then basically given to black people and say that this is your land, and you compare that to a map of arable soil for rain-fed agriculture, which measures the agricultural potential of all of the lands in South Africa, you can see something very interesting. In the first place, South Africa, 2/3 of the entire country is desert or semi-desert. It has zero potential for agriculture. Then, if you look at the black homelands and you compare it to the map of agricultural potential, you'll see, very interestingly, that the vast majority of the highest potential agricultural land in South Africa was under black control when the Land Act was enacted. It was under black control before that as well, and it is still mostly through trusts under black control today. So if this Land Act was enacted in order to oppress black people, why didn't they just make all of the Bantustans here in this area where there's nothing for them, and they would give all of this fertile land that is in this area as well as in this area to black people?
In the technical sense, and based on historical and geographical data, the claim that the land allocated for the Bantus, the homelands, was the best agricultural land in South Africa is actually false. While Willem Petzer and other similar commentators often use statistics about the quantity of the land currently owned or the potential of certain regions to argue that the landlessness is a myth, the historical reality of the quality of that land is well documented actually. We start with the 13% versus 87% disparity. Under the Natives Land Act of 1913 and the Native Trust and Land Act of 1936, approximately 87% of South African land, including the vast majority of high-quality arable land, was reserved for the white minority. The black majority, about 80% of the population, was confined to the remaining 13%, which became the Bantustans. Marginal versus arable land. Agricultural experts and historians categorize the land in the former Bantustans as marginal, meaning most homelands were located in areas with poor soil quality actually, highly susceptible to erosion, and part of it was semi-arid climates. The topography of areas like the Transkei and KwaZulu-Natal have high rainfall, which is often cited by people like Willem Petzer. However, much of this land is mountainous and steeply sloped, making large commercial crop farming significantly more difficult and expensive, and more expensive than on the flat, fertile plains of the Highveld, which was reserved for white farmers.
So what happened after the end of this Anglo-Boer War was most of these farmers couldn't farm anymore. They didn't have the funds to farm. They did have some land, but the land is useless if you don't have the infrastructure and the funds to actually operate your agricultural business. So this forced them into the cities.
Then you had your systematic underdevelopment. While the white commercial agricultural sector received massive state subsidies, irrigation infrastructure, and technical support, the Bantustans were overcrowded. The high population density in that 13% of land led to immediate overgrazing and soil erosion. Historically, these areas were described as labor reserves or dumping grounds. I call them labor settlements for people not needed in the white-owned urban and mining sectors, because you couldn't really stay anywhere else. It just wasn't allowed. You were restricted from where you could live and where you could be. In the homelands, you lacked the silos, the transport networks, and the water management systems necessary to make even good land productive. That's what the Apartheid revisionist leaves out.
A few moments later.
So what happened after the end of this Anglo-Boer War was most of these farmers couldn't farm anymore. They didn't have the funds to farm. They did have some land, but the land is useless if you don't have the infrastructure and the funds to actually operate your agricultural business. So this forced them into the cities.
They did not have the sort of infrastructure that white areas did. And all the sort of trains that ran and all the networks that they did have were not to feed the homelands, were not to support the homelands. Those were ways of getting resources out of the homelands, including people, into the central business areas, which were white areas and run by the fascist apartheid regime and white business owners and the like. Where does this claim come from? The grain of truth that Petsa and others often exploit is that some Bantustans, specifically the eastern seaboard, are in high rainfall zones. Technically, while these areas receive more rain than the arid Karoo, for instance, rainfall does not equal best agricultural land. Agricultural value is a combination of soil depth, nutrient levels, slope, and infrastructure. By focusing on rainfall or the current size of communal land, the claim ignores the fact that the most productive, flat, and nutrient-rich soil in the country, what is called the maize triangle, was almost entirely exclusively for white use. It excluded the Bantustan system.
Then there is the very, very interesting separate representation of Voters Act, which removed black, colored, and Indian South Africans from the voters' common roll in 1951. And it created a separate electoral system that caused different races of people to vote for their own representation within the government of South Africa, and they could vote also for their own governing bodies that governed over them specifically. Now, if the ANC would do this today, then it would basically mean that white people would elect their own government within the government of South Africa, and that might also not be the it would also not be the worst thing for what would be happening here.
The apartheid revisionist also likes to reframe the voting system, the proportional voting representative system of South Africa under the apartheid system. They like to phrase it as though it wasn't such a big deal and that people who weren't white actually had a significant say under the apartheid system and what would happen in this country. The voting system under apartheid was not a single static set of rules, but actually what it was a series of legislative maneuvers designed to consolidate and maintain white minority rule. It evolved from a flawed Westminster model into a complex, racially tiered system that basically stripped the majority of the population of their South African citizenship. The 1948 turning point. Before apartheid was formally codified, South Africa used the first-past-the-post system. In the 1948 general election, the National Party, the NP, won the majority of the seats in parliament despite receiving only 37.7% of the total vote. Their opponents, the United Party, won nearly 50% of the vote but lost the election. This happened because the NP's support was concentrated in rural constituencies that were loaded, meaning they need fewer votes per seat, while opposition support was diluted in large urban constituencies where you had more people but only needed a particular number for seats. The result is that this technical victory allowed the minority of the white electorate to implement the apartheid system for the next 46 years. The systematic disenfranchisement. Initially, a small number of black and colored men in the Cape Province held the right to vote on a common roll based on property and literacy qualifications. This was called the Cape Qualified Franchise. And this actually wasn't too different from what many countries around the world did, voting-wise. The NP government dismantled this through legal and constitutional manipulation. In 1951, the government introduced a separate representation of Voters Act to remove colored voters from the common roll This led to a major constitutional battle, often referred to as Harris versus Donges. When the courts initially blocked the law, the government packed the Senate with NP supporters and increased the number of judges in the appellate division to ensure the law would eventually pass. By 1956, all non-white voters were removed from the common roll, making the South African Parliament an exclusively white elected body. So now you look at the Bantustan voting system. For black Africans, the government implemented a policy of grand apartheid under the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act in 1959, so-called. Black South Africans were stripped of their South African citizenship and reassigned as citizens of 10 ethnic homelands or Bantustans, such as the Transkei or Bophuthatswana. The state argued that black people did not need to vote in white South Africa because they could just vote for their own governments in their homelands. Now remember that these governments in the homelands were largely puppet regimes founded and controlled by Pretoria. So black people could never actually vote against the government of Pretoria. You could never vote them out. While that vote meant nothing to the broad picture of who governs the country actually. The Tricameral Parliament of 1984. In an attempt to reform the system and co-opt other minority groups, a new constitution was introduced in 1984. It created a three-chamber legislation. The House of Assembly, which was white people only, had 178 seats. The House of Representatives, which was colored people only, had 85 seats. And the House of Delegates, which was Indians, had 45 seats.
I said, hold up, wait a minute, something ain't right.
Perhaps the apartheid revisionists can see that there was a certain group left out here. This was, of course, a sham.
You're a demon.
It excluded the black people, the majority, and they remained entirely excluded from the system. And that's exactly what they needed to do if they needed to hold on to power as a white minority. Because if you include them, then you're going to be voted out, which is exactly what happened 10 years later in 94, right? The setting up of this sham was a catalyst for the township uprisings of the 1980s. Willem Petzer likes to try and argue that the system gave black people a way to influence the government.
Stop it. Get some help.
I know he cannot be that ignorant, because the ratio was 4-1. The number of seats was fixed at this ratio that ensured that the White House, the White Assembly, could always outvote the other two combined on general affairs such as defense, finance, and foreign policy. And then you add to that the President's Council, which was a council to settle disagreements between the houses, which was also weighed heavily in favor of the White House of Assembly. So then when you get the transition in 1994, you see the apartheid voting system come to an end and the interim constitution of 1993 come into effect. And then in 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election based on universal adult suffrage, where every citizen over the age of 18, regardless of race, could vote on a single common roll. You don't have to be a great genius to see that those are two very different systems.
Let's ask ourselves, why is there such a big correlation between the Bantu homelands and agricultural potential? Well, firstly, obviously, it's because that the homelands were the areas that was already settled by black people at that stage. But if you go a little bit deeper and you ask yourself, why were these areas settled by black people, was because areas with high agricultural potential is the only areas that is possible to survive in without Western technology of the time. Without the technology to set up a wind pump, a windmill that pumps water out of the ground and to drill wells, it's not possible to live in any of this area that is desert or semi-desert. It's also not possible to live in any of this area that is highveld, because even though the highveld had a lot of rain, the highveld didn't have any natural rivers from which people can get drinking water. It's just massive swaths of grasslands that if you don't have the ability to drill for water, to set up windmills to pump water, you cannot survive in this area because you will die of thirst.
Another lovely one from Willem is that blacks could not survive in the dry places of South Africa, and he shows two maps. This is false. This is historically false. How had they lived on this land all these years if they had not figured out how to survive in these areas? And dryness was not the only threat, because you had other areas as you move up into the grasslands of Mpumalanga and the humidity of KwaZulu-Natal, which were also difficult to live in for other reasons. It wasn't just the dry. There are government minutes for meetings from 1918 where they're discussing the 1913 Land Acts. During the discussion of the 1913 Land Acts, while there were discussions of how to cut up the land and different places were being discussed, one of the things you see in these government minutes as different stretches of land were being discussed, you often see the witnesses in these meetings say things like, they describe them as not suitable for white men. That is because these are places black people had lived for centuries already in a natural way, in a tribal way, and were used to the climate and the ecosystem, whether dry, sparse water, mosquitoes, wildlife, or grassland, or anything else. Large tribes lived and thrived there, digging wells and digging canals, which is what the Bantu tribes used. So Mr. Petsa wants reasonable people to take his word for it that the Bantus could not live there, while the Union of South Africa, that government, and their documents say that people lived in large numbers for centuries already in those areas, whether it was dry places or grasslands or things like that. And you must remember, these were kingdoms. It was not just about villages and a certain tribe living in a particular place. Their lands stretched far wider than where they had their homes and their homesteads and their kraals, some of them kilometers away from their main kraal. This is the sadness of the revisionist. It is so unnecessary to rely on blatant untruths.
Then also there was a lot of social and cultural segregation, like prohibition of mixed marriages in 1959, Immorality Amendment Act of 1950, which was basically the same thing, and then also Separate Indemnities Act. So in other words, different benches for different races of people. And this is actually the act within apartheid that is brought up the most by people who want to show you how their human rights were abused during apartheid. They would show you the so-called apartheid bench, which is like a bench that says blankes, slegs blankes, or Europeans only. And this is the biggest proof of this so-called dehumanization of black people, with the fact that they had to sit in different areas on the bus, on different benches in the park, and walk through different doors, etc., etc.
Petsa also touches briefly on the separate amenities. He doesn't really address this and the immorality laws about who can date who can do what. Most of the time he just skips over these like they don't exist. Why? Does he deem them to be right? Does he agree with them? If he agrees with them, he can just say it's a free country now. Why act like there's nothing there? Like they don't matter? Those are kind of important rules, especially if you're going to write them into actual laws. It betrays what may be Mr. Petsa's true motives herein. By mostly saying nothing about these particular laws, it shows that perhaps he agrees with them, which begs the question then, if so, then what is his true motive for this reframing and revision of apartheid?
It is what it is. It is what it is.
Mr. Petsa would often also call apartheid not forced segregation, rather forced integration. And this comes to a very important thing. As South Africans, we have to face the fact and come to this once and for all. Are South Africans countrymen or are we not? Are we people of one country no matter the color? We might have different ethnicities, different races, different cultures, different beliefs, but do we have the shared values of countrymen? Are we one country? No matter the race or the color, are we not? Because that brings up many questions then. If not, why are the whites fighting so hard for this land? If they don't believe the other people living in this land of different colors are their countrymen, why are you fighting so hard for the land? You don't want to live with black people, yet you want to live in Africa. You are like a black man who moves to Japan and says, why are there so many Asian people here? Why are these Asians always around me the whole time? And if you're an Afrikaner or an English person who lives in South Africa but just can't stand to be around black people, you need to become more reasonable, because this is where the blacks are from. This is where they are. You've come to Africa and you want to live in Africa, you're going to have to be more reasonable and actually face the facts of that, don't you think?
The fact remains that BEE is forced economic integration, which steals one person's productivity to give it to another person in order to be compliant, which in my opinion is far worse than any of these laws that I read to you previously on this video. It is racial communism. That is all that it is.
A few moments later.
Which, by the way, if I say apartheid, it is actually just a word for segregation, an Afrikaans word for segregation. Was the fact that these mines that were controlled by Rothschild money tried to lower the prices of labor as much as they possibly can, because they knew the people were destitute. This was now after the Great Depression. The people were really destitute and they would basically work for anything. And actually, the South African Communist Party at that time, which led a strike, which had placards saying something like "Workers of the world unite for white South Africa," had this idea that black people were coming in and they were cheap labor for these mines, and therefore all of these white people were losing their jobs because black people were willing to work for even less, were willing to live in even more destitute situations. And then they said something needs to be done about this. And then obviously the majority of people at the end voted for the National Party, and the National Party started introducing segregation in the cities, which is apartheid.
It's worse than the laws from apartheid. BEE is worse than the laws from apartheid, he says. That is an evil thing to say. To equate BEE, as horrible as it is, with apartheid is a height of ignorance, hypocrisy, and low thinking. I don't think Petsa is ignorant. However, his comment does reach a new low. God forgive him. He does state one truth that revisionists often leave out, that BEE benefits no one but the connected types. It benefits the mass of black people even less than it does white people. In other words, it hurts black people even more than it does whites, does BEE. Look at the unfulfilled public hospitals, the unfulfilled schools, the unfulfilled school toilets, the unfulfilled policing contracts, the policing contracts that leave the whole country at risk. And that mostly affects people who can't afford private security and live in townships and informal settlements.
Only with you investing in us are we able to do the work we are doing going forward. Goodbye, and God bless.
Willem Petsa likes to end his videos with God bless, or God bless you. I agree with that. This is how he ends most of his videos actually, even the ones where he's doing some apartheid revisionism. The irony of ending a video on apartheid revisionism, where you sort of reframe apartheid as a good thing or a misunderstood thing, where you do that, a video like that, you end by appealing to the God that says all men are made in his image, after spending 10 minutes advocating for an idea whose entire premise was that some people are more human than others. You call this idea good and misunderstood for 10 minutes, then end with God bless you. That's evil. Apartheid revisionism even makes hard-working, intelligent men like Willem Petsa lazy thinkers and pushers of twisted facts like this man, Julius, making people reach for the easiest and most emotionally soothing answer to avoid the truth and feeling better about themselves and have a justification for hating.
Emotional, damn it!
He says this in one of his latest videos about the horrific trend of farm murders.
After Donald Trump raised awareness of the issue of violent farm murders and land grabs in South Africa in February last year, farm murders immediately dropped by 55% for the next 12 months. As we will highlight in today's video, the fact that the most powerful man in the world raised awareness of an issue, and when he played the videos of Julius Malema and
previous President Jacob Zuma singing Kill the Boer, going where no one on the international stage previously even dared to tread, he, for a very good reason, had a significant impact on the onslaught of white farmers and what they are facing in this country today. Unfortunately, that massive dip in farm murders is over now, as we've seen in the last week with farm murder after farm murder being reported.
The truth is that this is exactly how crime acts, actually. This is what you often hear of when criminals say that they are lying low, because there is a spotlight on their chosen crime. There is heat on them, in other words. They just lie low, just like the gangs in colored communities do when there are government raids or the government deploys soldiers to that community. Apartheid revisionists like to pose as though apartheid was a benevolent rulership, while British rule that did many of the same things apartheid did by undermining the Boer language, culture and history, stealing their land, burning and evicting them, arresting them, imprisoning them, fighting wars with them. When that is happening to the Boers, it is oppression and subjugation. When the Boers do it to black people, according to the apartheid revisionist, it is a benevolent and misunderstood rulership. No, sorry, Willem, that is not an argument fit for a Christian. For the non-Christian who also argues this, I suppose then you found your justification for hate. It's better you just be honest about that. It is nothing new under the sun, isn't it, Willem? Thank you for listening. If you dare, buy us a coffee. The link is in the description.
Magwala, cheche, Hoya Rona,
Only with you investing in us are we able to do the work we are doing going forward. Goodbye, and God bless.